And welcome to today's stream. I'm very excited to have with me Jo Michell. So, Jo is an associate professor at the University of West England in Bristol, and he is a fellow heterodox and post-Keynesian economist, which is what we're going to talk about today. And he is also a dear friend. Well, maybe not dear, but we know each other, don't we, a bit?
Very dear.
So, very dear. All right. So, hello everybody. So, chat's just appeared, Jo. You can't see it, but that confirms that I've managed to do everything. What's that?
It's probably for the best if I can't see it because it would distract me.
Yeah, it can be distracting. Yeah. So, yes, that means I've got all the tech right. But anyway, so, Jo, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. And I'm just going to jump right in because quite a few people, I titled this Post-Keynesian Economics with Jo Michell, and quite a few people are probably thinking, what the hell is Post-Keynesian Economics? So could you maybe give them an answer? Yeah, and that as well.
Let's try and do the first one. What the hell's Post-Keynesian Economics? All right. I would say that you can sort of define it at a very abstract level, and then you can define it at slightly more concrete levels. At the very abstract level, I think it's an approach to economics which tries to take a view on the thing we're trying to study, which I would say is capitalism. We're trying to understand how capitalism works, what the different mechanisms are, what the outcomes are, what kind of cause and effect mechanisms we see. And it takes a view that we don't want to be too precious about starting from really fine-grained scientific, mathematical kind of principles, which is one way of characterizing sort of more conventional textbook stuff. But we also want to be on the real world. We don't want to go too abstract. We don't want to spend the whole time talking about philosophy and metaphysics and abstract categories. So I think it's an approach which just tries to engage with the subject matter as you find it. The institutions that exist, the power structures that exist, the international financial system that exists, the monetary and banking system that exists. And it doesn't say, right, we're going to get all of these things from very first principles based on a few small things about how we think people's preferences and technology are specified. We just say, well, look, this is what the banking system looks like, and we're going to try and describe it the best we can, so we can reasonably quickly get somewhere and say something about, ideally, how policy should be enacted, how institutions can be designed, hopefully designed better. And I think sort of fundamental to the whole vision of post-Keynesian economics is the idea that market systems and the state are not really separable. There's no perfect market system out there which just works if you leave it alone. You always need management. You always need intervention. The market will do bad things, not the market, but without some kind of guiding hand, capitalism can go to bad places and does go to bad places. So a lot of post-Keynesian economics is about sort of thinking about the best ways to push back against those negative tendencies of capitalism while trying to retain and capitalize on some of the good, dynamic, productive elements. So that's a sort of a very high level of abstraction, probably not the definition that some people would go for as starting points, but I think that's where I'd go from. We try to understand the thing we're engaging with.
Thanks very much, Jo. So just before we get more into post-Keynesian economics, I want to say you've got one positive comment and one area for improvement on the chat. The first one is nice tannoy monitors.
Right. System 8, dual concentric. Yeah, they're classics. Thanks.
The second one is you're a little quiet. I don't know if there's anything you can do. You're actually turned up at full my end.
Yeah, I got a dial here. I'll turn it up a little bit. It's
that's really good.
Overdrive a touch, or maybe I'll bring the mic a little bit closer as well.
Yeah.
All right. Tell me if I'm too loud now.
Well, I think that's better for me as well.
Okay.
We've got 100 people in chat so far. Excellent. Hello, everybody. Yeah. Everyone to listen to you wouldn't have thought it, would you?
No.
So anyway,
you wouldn't either, would you?
No. So post-Keynesian economics. So I agree completely with that definition. And I actually, despite the fact that we've had many conversations about post-Keynesian economics in the past in private, I didn't know how fully you agreed with my definition of post-Keynesian economics, because it did strike me as the only school of economic thought, with the possible exception of institutional economics, which I think it dovetails quite nicely with, that just says, how does capitalism work? Like, what, why don't we just go into a bank? Why don't we go into a bank and see what happens? What happens in a bank when they grant credit? Why don't we go and study firms? Why don't we go and do case studies? How do they set prices? How do they set quantities? How do they manage themselves internally, their employees, and all of these things? And it just seemed like so much of economics seemed to be much more concerned with the abstract formalisms and the abstract categories and the theorizing that you were talking about.
Yeah, and I think we have to be a little bit careful, because when you're sort of, giving an overview of a, I'm just going to turn it down a touch because I'm overdriving now. Giving an overview of a view that you are in favor of, it's tempting to say, well, look, we're the ones who take reality seriously, and we use the correct levels of abstraction, and we understand the institutions. But I do think there is something to it. I mean, I think you could equally say Marxian economics does try to understand capitalism, in a very deep and I think coherent way. I think one thing about post-Keynesian economics is there's not a great deal of what I would call a priori reasoning, in the sense that we don't start with many things that we just say, we're going to assume this is true before we start. So neoclassical economics starts with particular ideas about how preferences guide behavior, and what well-behaved preferences are in terms of how you can rank them, how technology can be represented in a production function, and so on. Marxian economics starts with the labor theory of value as a very clear a priori assumption. We're going to assume that value is created by labor. Capitalism is about exploitation. Labor not receiving the work or the product which it's producing, and everything sort of follows from there. And much of that is extremely useful and informative. I would actually say both, both neoclassical and Marxian economics. I'm a pluralist in that sense. But there's something I would say to the view that post-Keynesian economics sort of tries to say, let's take a look at the features first and then see what we can say about it. And for that sense, it's not static. I mean, it does change. One of my favorite quotes from Vicky Chick, one of my favorite economists, Professor Victoria Chick, is something like, when she's talking about credit and money, she says something like, the theory of credit, interest, and money should never be independent of the state of institutions. You should always be updating your theory to match reality as it changes. And we've seen huge amounts of change recently in credit and monetary things, with the arrival of cryptocurrencies and all of that kind of stuff. And I think we should be updating our theories to match.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, abstraction is necessary, right? And you're always going to be talking about some kind of theory or some kind of model that ultimately isn't the real world, because otherwise, you can't deal with every single little detail in the real world, because it's completely unwieldy. That's why we have theories. That's why we have science. But it does seem that for, like you said, Marxists and neoclassicals, maybe Austrians, and maybe some other schools of thought, that they really do want to start with these theoretical assumptions and then kind of apply them to the world, rather than looking at the world first and taking what you might call, I guess, an inductive approach, where you see what categories exist, what's out there, what's going on, and then you start to develop your abstraction from there. So yeah, completely agree with that. So one thing about post-Keynesian economics that you didn't mention, or I missed, was the Keynesian, right? So what's it got to do with John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist?
Yeah, I mean, I as I said, I was starting from probably a higher sort of level of generality than most people might start with when asked what post-Keynesian economics is. So let's come to some more specific features of the analysis and of the view of capitalism that comes out, having said that, I think it's at least to an extent realistic. So a crucial element is the idea that demand matters, an aggregate demand matters, in the sense that in rich countries at least, and I think there's a debate here, which I'm partly involved in, I have something coming out on this, about the extent to which standard Keynesian, post-Keynesian views apply to lower income countries, countries which have reached are not as far along the process of capital accumulation, getting richer, as say the US, the UK, Western Europe. But rich countries can find themselves, and regularly do find themselves, in a position where there is insufficient economic activity. There's not enough work. There's not enough income. There's not enough going on. There are people sat at home without work, without good incomes, not because there isn't sufficient productive machinery, not because we haven't got the technology, we haven't got the installed capital, but because people are not spending enough. And to some people, that feels counterintuitive at first. I mean, how's that possible? If you've got all this physical productive capacity, if you've got the people to work with it, Say's law says, well, look, if you've got it, supply will create its own demand. So I think one really important element of Keynesian, post-Keynesian economics that comes both from Keynes and from Kalecki, and we'll talk about Kalecki a bit more perhaps, because I think he's equal, at least in terms of historical importance and the importance of his ideas to the ideas of post-Keynesian economics. They both very clearly claimed, and I think showed mechanisms how it could happen, that you could be in this kind of position. There's not enough spending in order to generate enough income that businesses hire all the people who would like to work, and therefore provide them with incomes. So an insufficiency of effective demand is the term that Keynes used. Aggregate demand is sometimes used. I actually tend to use just total expenditure, because I think it's an even clearer way of saying it. There's just not enough cash terms spending at any point in time, over any quarter or any year, to stimulate business to hire enough people to eliminate unemployment, or at least to bring it down to what we would consider a sensible or acceptable, let's say, level. So that's the principle of effective demand, I think, is a really central concept in Keynesian economics.
Yeah, and this is something, it's worth emphasizing how much Keynes and the slightly, well, not slightly, often neglected Kalecki, how much they changed economists' views of this, right? Because the context was the Great Depression in across European countries and the US in the 1930s, and there had been a doctrine for a long time that more or less this couldn't happen. You couldn't have a sustained shortfall of expenditure for a long time, because whatever was produced would ultimately create the income for it to be bought. And Keynes changed the thinking about that by in a lot of different ways, and that's, I think, post-Keynesians today say that they're following in Keynes's footsteps, right? And they're kind of, maybe you could put it, finishing what he started.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And not only did he turn around the idea of what was possible, but also what you should do about it. The prevailing view before Keynes was that the problem really in the Depression was that wages were too high. So what you need to do is cut wages, because that's the price which is stopping the market from clearing. If you think in a sort of simple supply and demand framework, then it's the wage which is the price of labor, and somehow something stopping the price. Workers are being unreasonable in their wage demands. Now, anybody, I think, who looked at the Great Depression in America, 25% unemployment, millions without work, would take any work they can get at almost any price, any wage they could get, would find it very hard to say that's the right description of what's going on. But people were advocating, before Keynes's time, and still do sometimes, for wage cuts to solve the unemployment problem. And Keynes argued forcefully that this will make the problem worse. If you cut people's wages during a depression, there will be even less spending power, and therefore even less income for the businesses and the entrepreneurs, and therefore even less incentive for them to raise their output and employ more workers. So Keynes argued quite the opposite is the problem. What we need is more expenditure. I think one important element of Keynes, which gets a little bit overlooked in modern discussion, is that really Keynes and Kalecki pinpointed business investment. They said the single thing which sort of is the cog which drives all the other cogs is business investment. If that's high enough, it'll generate full employment, it'll generate good incomes, it'll generate economic activity. But if business investment is too low, and we'll come to maybe the reasons as to why business might not be investing, then something else needs to step in and fill the gap in expenditure. And that's where government spending comes in, and fiscal deficits and so on, which I think is perhaps how Keynes is more popularly known these days, as an argument for government spending, running deficits, issuing bonds to increase the size of the government debt. While that I think is to a degree true, I think the really crucial element of both his and Kalecki's description of how capitalism works is to do with business investment and the requirement that is stabilized.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I forgot
interesting.
what your question was. I think I went off on a tangent there. What did you ask me?
I just asked about, well, I just kind of commented on Keynes, the context of Keynes and the shortfall of aggregate demand. So no, I think that was completely relevant.
Okay.
I was just going to say that I think you often see Keynes get mischaracterized as kind of consumption expenditure, and basically him wanting to increase consumption expenditure in a recession. Now that may be the case as a temporary measure, stopgap measure in some circumstances, just spend money, dig holes and fill them in, that kind of thing, right? But it is interesting that most of the general theory is focused on this fluctuation in investment, right? And that is really what needs to be stabilized, because he says consumption is relatively stable as a component of aggregate demand, but investment isn't, and for lots of different reasons, like you alluded to. And I think he did propose fiscal policy, but he also proposed some other policies to rectify that, not just in the general theory, but kind of across his life. And I'm not convinced that he ever entirely settled on one set of policies. I think he was quite pragmatic, and it varied across his life. There's everything from lower interest rates to the Bretton Woods international financial system to manage exchange rates, and all of these different things, and it was all aimed at trying to stabilize this investment component of capitalism.
Yeah, and I think Keynes is not entirely consistent, and I think that's quite deliberate. Keynes was extremely aware of the audience he was talking to and the political context, and he would change his message to suit the context and to fit what he thought was the correct policy proposal of the time. And I don't think that's particularly there's anything wrong with that, to be honest. But it does mean that you try and sort of pull out a completely coherent set of views from Keynes. You don't get something similar to Kalecki, whereas Kalecki really does, he sort of early on develops a quite clear set of ideas, and then sort of through repeated iterations, he's sort of polishing them and adding to them, but it doesn't change that much, whereas Keynes is involved in all kinds of things. He's involved in all kinds of international affairs and political disputes and so on. So I think the story does change. You mentioned something in your previous comment about, post-Keynesians see themselves in a way as picking up unfinished business. And there is quite an important debate about the extent to which Keynes had the right ideas, but didn't fully manage to leave behind some of the baggage that he brought with him, because he was a very conventional economist. He says at the beginning of the general theory, I think, I used to teach all these ideas, the quantity theory of money, Say's law, wages being the price which equalizes supply and demand for labor. And it's been a long struggle for me to escape and realize that this isn't how capitalism works. It works differently, or at least it can work differently much of the time. But many of the tools he uses are what we call Marshallian tools, named after Alfred Marshall, Keynes's teacher, a very important economist in his own right, who developed much of sort of conventional supply and demand type analysis. And some argue that it was the wrong framework. He really needed to throw away more of the conventional stuff than he did. Kalecki did, I think, move further away, or had moved further away. And then people like Joan Robinson, who were sort of immediate followers who knew both Keynes and Kalecki, sort of argued that, Keynes showed us the direction, but there's more to be done in developing and sort of extending these ideas and escaping some of the Marshallian apparatus. I don't have a very strong view on that one. I think a lot of what Keynes said was fairly well developed, but I also think the post-Keynesians have done a lot since, which is very useful, and does, we learn a lot more from it.
Yeah, that brings us nicely to sort of from the historical to more modern post-Keynesianism. I just want to respond to a couple of messages on chat. Aaron Kumar says, if I pronounce Keynesian wrong, am I liable to get made fun of? No, because almost everybody pronounces it wrong.
There are lots
Um,
of different pronunciations, and
yeah,
people come from all over the world. So
yeah,
there's nothing. You call it anything you like.
exactly. And Aidan Clare says, I'm trying to read the general theory. Trying. Yeah, I understand. I think I hear you there. It's tricky.
One tip I wish I'd had when I tried to read the general theory is Joan Robinson's Theory of Employment is a really good, short, accessible kind of summary. It's almost like a kind of idiot's guide to the general theory. So if you haven't got that, pick it up and try reading that alongside. It's almost chapter by chapter. It kind of matches the general theory, but she kind of explains it much more clearly and simply and says this is what he was trying to say, but he was, he kept getting muddled up as he was trying to say it.
Yeah, yeah. Chapter 6 in particular, I remember being as basically impenetrable, and I don't think I ever grasped that. No, but Joan Robinson. So let's talk about let's go through history and talk about Joan Robinson, because she's often called like the first post-Keynesian economist or the first heterodox economist, right? And she, as I said, kind of took up where Keynes left off. So like what kind of things did she develop on? What kind of things did she add?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly if she was, post-Keynesian in the sense we now use it. She definitely used the term, but I'm not sure if she meant it in quite the same way that we do. But I think it's reasonable to claim her as a very early person who was moving very much in the direction of where post-Keynesian economics subsequently went. She did a number of things. She's famous for the capital controversies, which are a very technical and complicated debate, and probably it's not something we want to get too bogged down on.
I don't think so.
Between followers of Keynes in Cambridge, UK, and people like Samuelson and Solow, who confusingly were in Cambridge in Massachusetts and in the US. So there was Cambridge against Cambridge, hence the name, the Cambridge controversies. And it was to do with the nature of technology and the relationship between technology and distribution, and the implications of things like the Solow growth model, which have recently been developed, which take, for people who know what we're talking about, take a thing called a Cobb-Douglas production function and sort of say, okay, let's imagine that, the macro economy, the world, or a big piece of the world, behaves a bit like this production function, and then let's see what happens. And there are a whole bunch of things which come out of it, including a sort of implication that the distribution of income between labor and capital, workers and capitalists, or profits and wages, is determined by technical things like how productive labor is, how productive capital is, how much of each you've got, people's preferences, and so on. And the Keynesian view, the view of people like Kalecki and Robinson, was, I think, very influenced by Marx, who argued that our relations really matter. I mean, a lot of what matters in terms of who gets what in capitalism doesn't come down solely to, what kind of machine is being used or how much education or training labor has. It comes down to who is able to squeeze who, in sort of not too pleasant terms. And this is very much kind of airbrushed away in that kind of neoclassical Cambridge US view. So that's the kind of ideological backdrop, I think. I mean, I think there's a kind of ideological dispute going on there between two visions of capitalism as a sort of ordered, sort of consensual, contractual system where everybody sort of comes to the market and exchanges, versus something much kind of murkier and darker with a kind of Marxian influence where power relations
Of course, no. Mainstream economists don't have ideology, Joe. They're just completely neutral and value free.
This is one of the things I think Joan Robinson's really good on. I recently read her economic philosophy just the last couple of months for something I've been writing, and she says everybody has ideology. Don't kid yourself. The only people who, if you say you haven't got it, you're just kidding yourself. And the best thing we can do is admit it, identify it, and say, look, I'm interested in these questions because I have an ideological predisposition, and so I care about inequality, or I care about class conflict, or I care about developing countries, lower income countries, being subordinated to richer countries. That comes from a kind of ideological perspective to a degree. Some people wouldn't focus on those issues. And she says we should just try our best to keep it separate from the technical analysis. How is the system working? What's it doing currently? How could we change it? So I don't really buy the view that other people don't have ideologies. That said, I think saying that there is a single ideology which sits behind something called neoclassical economics, it probably isn't true. It's just too big and broad, and there are just too many people in it. So I think you can find anything from borderline communists right up to free market zealots, because it's quite flexible. I mean, for all its flaws, and you and I both have criticized it and continue to criticize it, but you can do quite a lot with it. You can, as Tajun Chang says, you can get any result you want from the model by plugging it into your assumptions. So I think there are kind of implicit views hidden in the maths, and there's also ideology of the people who are using the tools. But I think it's probably a bit more complicated than some people who say, it's just apologism for the free market and this kind of thing. Now we've gone right off on a tangent.
Yeah, this is what the streams are all about. That's why people like them. They're not like a 12-minute media interview where you're only allowed to talk for 30 seconds about a pre-specified list of points. I mean, yeah, it's interesting about the ideology thing. I think because one of the things about the Austrian school, which really would be a tangent, so I don't want to talk about it too much, but the Austrian school, which is very free market, but also very anti-maths and anti-neoclassical, they kind of emerged at a time when that mathematical economics was being used to defend socialism, right? And so, that was, again, probably part of the reason that things developed the way they did, and they rejected that maths completely. So you're right, you can use neoclassical economics to justify a wide range of things. But yeah, I think everybody has ideology in these instances. It's a question of, what outcomes you care about, what you choose to focus on, and how you interpret results too. People can interpret the same, result very, very differently. So, I think I would rather, as economists, we're a little bit more upfront about that. But then there's a difference, right, as well, because, like you said, if your analysis leads you... So, for example, I'm pretty leftist, and actually I would call myself a socialist. But for me, the Marxian labour theory of value just doesn't work. Right, and Marx used it in a way. Marxists are going to have a go at me no matter what I say now. In a way, to justify socialism, but there might be other ways to justify socialism than the labour theory of value. I just think that it's generally wrong. So yeah, I wonder what keeps you. So this is one of the things I actually wrote down to ask you. So if you're a post-Keynesian, it's safe to say you're probably going to be significantly left of your average mainstream economist, probably a kind of social democrat type, or radical social democrat type. What keeps you from going kind of full into Marxism or other much more radical theories? Maybe elements of ecological economics can be quite radical. What keeps you from going like all the way and being almost anti-capitalist?
That's a good question. I might just briefly defend the labour theory of value, seeing as you've taken the other side.
Okay.
I think, and again, that kind of comes from Joan Robinson. As I said, I read economic philosophy recently, and it definitely had quite a lot of influence on me. She kind of says, look, there are metaphysical ideas. These are ideas that you can't really measure, and you can't use for prediction, and you can't model, but they do tell you something about the way the world is and what you should look for and what you should be worried about. And then you have sort of scientific methods, and she draws a distinction between Marx's labour theory of value and scientific economics, as she describes scientific economics, the attempt to be scientific. But I do think the idea that what's produced is in some way related to how much work goes into it, and therefore that the distribution of what's produced should have some relation to the amount of effort that goes in. It is a very powerful idea, and I think it's quite implicit in a lot of post-Keynesian models. A standard way of modeling prices and wages is just that firms mark up over wages, and that markup reflects the power of the firms over the workers. And in a sense, it's almost an analog to Marx's rate of exploitation, although it's represented slightly differently. And so I do think it's a very powerful idea and a very useful idea when thinking about capitalism. But I don't think it gives us a theory of prices or something you can operationalize to give clear predictions. And also because it's got lots of different elements. It's got a kind of normative, ethical element. It's got a kind of descriptive element. People take different things, and so people can almost disagree what exactly is the labor theory of value. But there's, for example, you see these pictures in the Financial Times where they show you, of every £2 spent on a cup of coffee, how much is marketing, how much is branding, how much is transport, how much goes to the people who pick the coffee beans, and it's invariably, 2p or something, some terrible fraction. And I can't look at those pictures without thinking in, sort of purely Marxian labor theory of value terms, and just think, there's something wrong here. Those workers are producing the coffee, but they're not getting the sales price. So in that sense, I don't think it's wrong. I just think it's wrong to think that you can use it for modern scientific economics in the way that we might want to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, as a scientific theory, I don't think it holds up. I think that's the important thing. And I don't think that, marginalist value theory holds up either, by the way. It's because, they are, like Joan Robinson said, metaphysical concepts. But just because they don't hold up as scientific theories, that doesn't mean they aren't helpful for our thinking. And I think this comes down to accepting that economics isn't really truly a science, which is something that people in chat have been talking about quite a lot, by the way. It may have scientific elements, and you may be able to make some contextual predictions at some times and places, but you're not going to get a grand theory of everything. And I think value theory is often an attempt to do that, to get the grand theory of capitalism. And when you work out kind of the labor theory of value mathematically and kind of test its predictions, it depending on the interpretation, it's either wrong or just very difficult to test, and there's different data sets suggest different things. So that was what I was talking about. Again, I agree with you. I think the labor theory of property, which is kind of been billed as an alternative to the labor theory of value, is very good, which basically just states that, not that labor is the only source of value, but simply that what labor creates has value, and labor should be able to own it, in short, right? So that kind of dovetails with what you were saying about the people who are picking the coffee, and there's some really good work. I think G.A. Cohen has talked about the labor theory of property. He's got a really good article critiquing Marxian value theory, and David Ellerman is also really good on this, on property and contract and labor owning what it produces. So yeah, I think I do tend to agree, but I just wonder at the kind of the years, the decades, the centuries spent interpreting, trying to make sense of these elaborate theories of value, and just it all being a dead end,
Yeah, in a sense, I think that's kind of the answer to your question, in a sense of why don't I go further in some of these directions, into Marxian value theory and the sort of politics that goes with it. Often is that I think I am driven by a sense that I want to be doing something which may have practical relevance. You may be able to look at something I've done and say, this could inform redesign of institutions, whether it's the relationship between the central bank and the treasury, or international monetary arrangements, or labor bargaining arrangements. And in that sense, I think it depends on your definition of science. I think I used to take the view that economics is not a science and could not be a science. I think, take the view that it can be a science in the weak sense, in the sense that, say, psychology can be a science, if we're very careful and we just, admit where we're being driven by our ideologies, admit, when we're just trying to do the best with a bad job. This is the data we've got. This is our attempt to identify a causal mechanism. These are the things which look as if we've got one. These are the things which say maybe you haven't. On this basis, can we say anything about, should the Bank of England be independent of the Treasury, for example? And I guess those are the kinds of questions which I'm interested in. I sort of got into economics because, I could see that there were lots of things in the world which I didn't like, and whenever you sort of follow the piece of string, why is it like this? Why do we have such obvious disparities in income and opportunity. Why are we destroying the planet, and why don't we seem to be able to do anything about it? Why is there such obvious disparity between different countries and levels of development and income? Those were the kind of questions that got me interested. But I did want to ideally be able to say something about what we might be able to do to make things better. And I think I'm actually a lot more cautious now than I was. You sort of come into a subject thinking, I could go and work for one of the agencies which does this stuff and make things better. And now I'm very cautious because I realize how easy it is to make things worse with the wrong policies and the wrong advice. So it's a difficult subject in that sense. But I think that's probably what keeps me sort of, sellout centrist, if you like, social democrat, post-Keynesian, at least from the perspective of some, although probably being a bit harsh. I think I'm probably on that boundary between. I'm not sure where the line between a social democrat and a socialist is. I think it comes down to your definition, but that's the kind of place where I am in terms of ideology and policy ideas.
Yeah, that's completely fair. I think my motivation for studying economics was very similar. Just seeing, I in 2008 I was 18, right? So this is the financial crisis, which seemed like a big deal at the time, but it's right now it seems relatively small fry. But it was this massive crash, and I was just thinking, my God, why did nobody see this coming? Why is nobody able to make sense of it? Economics just seemed really, really important, more so than maybe any other subject, and it seemed to sort of underpin other subjects as well, because I sort of thought, well, I could go into physics and try and invent something that helps with renewable energy, but what if all the funding for that is cut or something like that? You know what I mean? So yeah. But anyway, so let me bring us back to post-Keynesian economics, because as we've discussed this a lot. I'll put it simply: post-Keynesian macroeconomics, as in the economics of the whole economy, does a much better job of describing the world for the past 40 years than pretty much any other school of thought. Now, I say that somewhat glibly because the explanation that we can give combines elements of a few different schools of thought, but I think post-Keynesian economics does it best. So I wrote this down. So Jason Furman, who some of you may recognize that name. He was the advisor to he was in the Council of Economic Advisors in Obama's White House, now teaches introductory economics at Harvard. So he replaced Greg Mankiw on his course, and it is a better course. Credit to Furman. He's definitely improved. But I think in 2018, identified 6 key features of the economy. So this is pre-pandemic, right? But arguably, I think the post-Keynesian view has actually been vindicated even more post-pandemic. But these 6 were: rising market concentration, as in firms are getting bigger, more monopoly, more oligopoly; higher markups over costs, what Joe was just talking about, more profit versus wages, basically; falling investment; slow productivity growth. So we had what was sometimes called secular stagnation, which Larry Summers called it, and that was something again that really chimed with post-Keynesian economics. Rising inequality, number 5, and 6th, reduced churn or dynamism. So the economy seemed to be a little bit more stagnant. And so these 6 things, right, are basically, and Jason Furman, I stress, is a very mainstream economist. That basically just constitutes post-Keynesian macroeconomics, as far as I understand it, right, Joe? So, I mean, could you comment a little bit? I know there's a lot there, but could you comment a little bit on like that post-Keynesian view of the macroeconomy and why it sits with those stylized facts so well?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And you mentioned the financial crisis and how it's receding into view. But I think it's really important still, because many of the trends we're now grappling with, including the sort of post-pandemic reopening and so on, you can trace them back to the 2008 crisis, the expansion of the financial system, and then the massive expansion of central bank activity in response, which is now still with us and becoming, even over the pandemic, it got even more. extreme in a way, and we could come back and talk about that in a bit. But I think it's probably reasonable to say that prior to 2008, so we're going back a long way, but prior to the crisis, there was quite a laissez-faire view in standard mainstream macroeconomics. I said earlier, you've got to be careful about being too broad brush in characterizing, but if you look at the way the models work and the way that people talked, there was a view that the economy was basically self-correcting. It suffers a bit because prices can take a while to adjust, but as long as you've got a central bank which is watching carefully and is adjusting the policy rate of interest, the central bank lending rate, then everything is basically on track. And during that time, the post-Keynesians were saying, no, it's not on track. Look at the size of credit expansion. Look at the growth of inequality. Look at cross-border imbalances between surplus and deficit countries. And, had a coherent story that tied all these things together, connected to this idea I said at the beginning about inadequate expenditure. So one element of the Keynesian story, the post-Keynesian story there are several different bits, but one important element is that rising inequality, all else equal, leads to lower total expenditure, because the rich tend to save more of their income and the poor tend to spend more of their income as a proportion. The poor might spend 80% of their income, the rich might spend 30% or 50% of their income. So all else equal, if there's redistribution from those on lower incomes to higher incomes, you get a decline in the total amount of income which is spent. And then this requires offsetting action elsewhere. And what we probably saw, what post-Keynesian would argue, is that over that long period, that was kind of matched by interest rates. Central banks were trying to compensate for weak expenditure by lowering interest rates, at the same time as deregulating the financial system. So then you had big credit expansion and instability. A big part of the post-Keynesian story, drawing from Minsky, but lots of other people too, is that the financial system is inherently unstable and will always generate oscillations which become amplified and will then cause crises and sort of restoration. Before 2008, this was a very unfashionable view. Again, people thought that the financial system was self-correcting, not only the macroeconomic system, but also the financial system. Post 2008, there has been a lot of soul searching. There was a very big kind of macroeconomics has failed kind of moment. And people looked at the state-of-the-art models of the time and said, these were completely useless. We were looking under the lamppost where the light was when all of the action was happening over there in the dark. And I think, the stylized facts you mentioned, rising inequality, increasing concentration, falling labor share relative to profit, weak demand, expansion of the financial system. You didn't actually have that in your list of stylized facts, but you can find it in other kind of, lists of what went wrong, are all unremarkable. They're sort of what post-Keynesian economics would predict would happen without countervailing forces, and many post-Keynesian economists were pointing to over that time. You can find several articles from before 2008 pointing to these various trends, and I think putting them together, not exactly right. You can point and say some bits of this analysis were underdeveloped or some bits weren't completely correct. But I think if you were to sort of put the two views side by side and say who was doing a better job of describing what's happening in modern global capitalism, I do think that the post-Keynesians were much closer to the mark. And it's interesting watching so-called mainstream macro sort of edging closer. And some people find it, I think, some people in the sort of heterodox community find it irritating and a bit frustrating. But I think it's generally a positive thing. If these are the features of capitalism which are important and we've been emphasizing, and it's now becoming acknowledged that that's the case, while it can be frustrating about, are these ideas being acknowledged correctly and so on, the important thing is that the sort of movement of travel, I think, in policy discussions is now a lot closer to a post-Keynesian view than it would have been. But now, of course, we have the big challenge of the post-pandemic inflation, which we maybe want to talk about that separately, because that's, I think, turned everything kind of 180 and has the potential to mess things up a lot. I mean, I actually think that you can explain that perfectly well in a post-Keynesian sort of framework, but there is a view, I think, out there that, post-Keynesian economics, or MMT, which is a sort of, a more visible version of post-Keynesian economics, if you like, called it wrong, and is now has been shown to be flawed, and there's a kind of fight back against some of these ideas. But I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, that was really, really well put. I think sorry, my mic seems to be going a little bit AWOL. But so yeah, the post-Keynesian economics basically seems to make sense of all of these different things together. Because, you know, if you've got rising inequality, then you might have inadequate aggregate demand. You might have an increasing reliance on credit. You might have, therefore, you know, lower investment. You might have investment that's more speculative. Again, like you said, you know, Jason Furman didn't identify the financial aspects of this in that particular talk, but that's another thing that post-Keynesians have been banging on about for a very long time. The financial sector really matters. It matters that it's grown as a percentage of the economy, whereas the more conventional view might say that, you know, the link between there's not much of a link between the real and the financial or the monetary economies, right? So yeah, post-Keynesian economics kind of makes sense of all these things. And then there's also the argument about monopoly and how that leads to stagnation. And that goes back to like not just post-Keynesians, but Marxists. And so it's just, yeah, it seems that post-Keynesians were the ones who were warning before 2008. And it seems that their framework is the one that would identify these types of stylized facts. And yet you don't see any acknowledgement from mainstream economists like Furman. Although it's worth saying, Larry Summers, as much as I hate him, has said that post-Keynesians were right. I think he actually much more directly cites post-Keynesians, and I think maybe it might be because, I mean, I appreciate what you say about trying to view it as a positive and not getting irritated, but I think maybe getting irritated on Twitter might have been one of the ways that people actually from the mainstream started to be alerted to these ideas, right? Because I think it's typical of academics on Twitter. They're all very protective of what they do. And if you suggest that it hasn't been done, I think then you will get lots of angry academics in your mentions. So, you know, I wonder if that has facilitated the spread of some post-Keynesian ideas, certainly of MMT, but even like within academic circles, I'm not sure.
No, I think so. I mean, having said getting irritated is perhaps not the most useful thing to do. I think it is useful to point out that these ideas existed. There's a lot of merit to them. I mean, in a sense, it's not a particularly complicated story. It's a fairly straightforward account, you know, very broad brush terms of what was going on. And it's kind of notable that standard models couldn't really cope with that. You know, that fairly straightforward story about rising inequality, increasing market power, weakening expenditure, credit expansion to make up for it, different kind of growth models, you know, export-driven countries such as Japan and Germany responding to weak demand in one way versus deficit countries such as the Anglo-Saxon countries, the US and the UK. It's not a hugely complicated story. There's a lot going on. But the fact that the little assumptions in neoclassical models kind of ruled it out, at least the way they were put together before the crisis, I think is interesting. And it's worth pointing out, as you say.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about this, because about the policy response in the pandemic, because I think one of the key things, right, and we've touched on this a few times, that comes out of post-Keynesian economics is that governments can never afford not to manage or boost the economy somehow to ensure that there's a high level of expenditure or demand, and to ensure therefore that we're at full employment, basically. And that's that contrasts to maybe the more mainstream view, where sure, you might have fiscal policy, you might have active government, but it's probably confined to a downturn, right? And so for post-Keynesians, you want to have pretty aggressive aggregate demand management. Now, because of the pandemic, we sort of had a bit of an experiment with this. Now, it wasn't, you know, post-Keynesianism wasn't tailored to what you should do during a pandemic in particular, obviously. It was actually more tailored to what you should do the rest of the time. But we have seen a massive expansion of stimulus of both consumption, just sending money to households for them to survive, but also, especially in the USA, you've seen a big stimulus package. Right. So do you think that these things basically followed post-Keynesian principles? And if so, do you think the outcome's been good or mixed or bad?
I think we're still waiting for the dust to settle on all this and trying to unpick what it is that's been driving the inflation. I mean, we know the broad brush story, lockdowns, shutdowns, enforced closure of huge amounts of the economic system, followed by partial reopening and a big switch in consumption activity, a switch from services, people going to restaurants and live music and so on, to buying things for their houses, buying consumer durables and garden furniture and so on. That putting stress on global supply chains because so much of production is globalized and leading to price pressures. Alongside that, we did have big pandemic policy action, which varied, I think, quite substantially. We probably should come back and talk about the difference between, say, the Eurozone versus UK versus the US. And I think it's quite clear that the US went bigger. And then we got the war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we're now seeing sort of 10% inflation numbers. It does start to look as if some of those numbers are peaking out. I mean, I've said it before and I've been wrong, but I'm going to say it again. I think we probably are at the point of probably close to the peak of the current inflation, and it should start to subside. However, there will be more shocks, and we're going to have to get used to, I think, in a world of climate change, in a world of war, drought, famine, flood, etc. We're going to have to get used to the idea of supply shocks, and I think it may be the case that where we've been living in, I think, arguably a Keynesian world in the sense that a demand-constrained world for the last 20 or 30 years, and many of the symptoms that we identified reflect that, we may be living in a supply-constrained world for the next however long, next decades potentially. Now, I don't think those are necessarily rule each other out. They're not completely mutually exclusive. I think it's quite possible that we can have supply shortages from climate effects and other awful things alongside, at least localized inability to use the labor that we have. But I think we're going to have to think a lot about how to update our ideas on all this. And it's a big challenge, I think, for Keynesian economists like myself. On the question of whether the policy itself was right or wrong, it was very Keynesian in the sense that there was huge fiscal deficits. There was huge amounts of quantitative easing action by the central bank, which I think people get very excited about. And I think it's less exciting than, it's interesting and important, but it's often sort of badged as printing money. So people kind of imagine just, money pouring into people's hands and therefore chasing up prices by trying to buy things. And it really isn't. It isn't that. Quantitative easing at the time it happened was the central bank going to pension funds, which had government bonds, which issued zero yield, and replacing them with central bank deposits, bank deposits backed by through a chain central bank reserves, also issuing zero yield. So it was a very technical and I think largely, to a degree, uninteresting operation. But, from a sort of crude perspective, you can say, okay, well, this was post-Keynesian. You had big deficits, you printed loads of money, now you've got inflation. What did you expect? We've proved that your theory was wrong. I don't think that's the correct conclusion. Number one, the inflation is driven very substantially on the supply side. I mean, we've just got horrific supply shortages of wheat, shortages of fertilizer, shortages of fuel, and demand for those things is inelastic. People eat the amount they eat. They have to heat their houses without, the longer term solutions of insulation and so on. So prices are extremely volatile. Prices of food and fuel are extremely volatile and react very strongly to supply shortages. Did the US stimulus in particular make the situation worse? I think it's perfectly plausible that it did. Larry Summers said that sending the checks to the household was excessive. Could it have been done without such, whatever it was, $2,700? I forget the exact numbers. It does, from some readings of the data, it looks as if inflation went up more in the US than elsewhere. The labor markets got tighter in the US relative to elsewhere. So I think probably the response is part of what we've seen, and possibly the US response may have been overcooked a bit. The Eurozone response was much weaker, and until now, Eurozone inflation has been weaker, although it's now pretty high, largely driven by gas prices and so on. The UK is also caught up. So I think the evidence is we're still out on this, and I think a lot of it depends on where we go from here. Another question is, would it have been better to have lower inflation but higher unemployment at this point? I mean, if there had been weaker stimulus in rich countries and unemployment was 2 or 3% higher, would that be a better outcome? I don't think we know. I think anybody who says I've got a clear answer to that, I think that's a very difficult welfare problem to try and solve. During the pandemic, I was uncomfortable with people using the word stimulus, people saying, we need fiscal stimulus in the face of a supply shock. I mean, Keynesian economics doesn't say you should do demand stimulus when the supply side is contracting. The correct way to think about what was done in the pandemic, in my view, was life support rather than stimulus. It was simply, we had to get money to people who didn't have work, whose businesses had shut down or who had, put them out of business or out of work. There were people who just needed money to stay in their houses to feed their children, and you just had to get them money one way or another. But treating that as stimulus, treating that as trying to stimulate demand, I think was wrong. If anything, you might almost want to counteract that life support with demand offsetting measures. But as I say, the difference in scale was quite substantial in the US compared to the UK. So I think the evidence is still unclear on that. I think there's another aspect to this which is not talked about a great deal, and this is a really important area, which is the international aspect. The US can get away with doing that kind of huge stimulus, importing goods from across the world, supply chains getting overloaded to an extent, to a substantial extent, because it is the US, because it issues the dollar. But that gives it huge power in terms of international transactions, international creditor kind of agreements. What I'm very worried about at the moment is what's going to happen to lower income countries. As the US reacts to inflation by raising interest rates, as some are advocating it should, we're going to potentially, I think, see some very unpleasant reactions in terms of cash which has flown into lower income and middle income countries, particularly what are called emerging markets, kind of middle income countries, Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, these kinds of countries, looking for short-term gains, returns on wealth, which you can't get in the UK or in the US because interest rates are so low. As monetary conditions tighten in response to the inflation, the outflows we're going to see from many, I think, lower income countries are going to be really unpleasant. And the pressure for policymakers in those countries to raise interest rates, to cut back on government spending is going to be really severe. If you look at the rates of interest on government debt, for example, in many lower and middle income countries, they're really, hair-raising, horrific kind of numbers, 10%, 12% on government bonds, 10-year bonds, that kind of thing. So there's a big international aspect to this, which I think often gets overlooked in discussion about, was the stimulus the right size? Was it too big? Was it not big enough? Does it disprove post-Keynesian? Does it disprove MMT? Is that we're still in the after effects, and I think many lower income countries are really going to be suffering. And so there's a sort of almost a bigger question, I think, about fixing the international financial architecture to try and offset those shocks. Now I've gone to a completely new tangent here.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, it's all really interesting. It's obviously all interconnected. It's interesting that you think inflation has reached its peak. I mean, I thought that in almost a year ago now, partly because the monthly inflation figures were coming down and then they kind of went back up. So now I'm just really cautious about making any predictions.
Yeah, no, I say it with very little confidence. I wouldn't say they've reached their peak. I say that on some indicators it looks as if they may be starting to peak.
Okay. That's a more cautious comment. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like I said, the pandemic isn't the perfect test of any policy. To try and kind of summarize some of what you said, I mean, like, for a start, I agree. It's not stimulus when you're in a pandemic, right? People need to eat. That's why you're giving them money, and you're not stimulating the economy. You're doing actually the opposite. You're shutting down large portions of it, right? So, like, that's really not. You shouldn't think of that as post-Keynesian. What you maybe should think of as post-Keynesian is the stimulus package passed. Don't want to say after the pandemic, because it's not after the pandemic, but after the deepest part of lockdown in the US, the stimulus package passed there was perhaps post-Keynesian. And it was interesting, actually, because I think there were kind of some attempts to ease the supply side pressures. So I think supply side can be a bit of a dirty word for any kind of lefty type economist, because you associate it with those people who say, well, it's always the supply side. This goes back to the beginning of when we were talking about people who say any type of recession is caused by supply side factors. Any type of economic turmoil is supply side factors. You've got to deregulate and loosen up the economy. But of course, what we've had in the pandemic are huge supply chain disruptions that are not vague and amorphous like that other type of supply side economics where it's always the same answer. These are concrete things that have happened to, for example, microchips. And I think you've seen from Biden some early moves to try and address that, for example, through things like onshoring, right, and saying that we should produce certain things within the USA so that we always have that kind of resilience. I'm not sure if you'd necessarily consider that a post-Keynesian policy. I think that the MMTers, the modern monetary theorists, who are kind of like post-Keynesians, I think they've increasingly been supporting those types of policies. So more kind of identifying where the inflation is, because inflation right now, it's not even, is it? It's not actually generalized. And actually, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but you don't see it in wage inflation, for example. So it doesn't seem to be across the whole economy. It's in specific sectors. And so policies that target those sectors may be one way, and try to expand supply in those sectors and generally, make them work better. That those policies may be one way of trying to deal with inflation in a post-Keynesian way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to reclaim the language of the supply side, actually, because supply side economics is a sort of shorthand for free market kind of trickle down economics, which I think we all agree is a bad idea. But there is another approach to the supply side, which is to do with industrial policy. It's to do with upgrading, investment, technological advancement, helping lower income countries climb that ladder and reach those levels of productivity and output. And that's kind of fallen, I think, a little bit off the radar. Post-Keynesian economics has focused on very much on demand side mechanics, and I think we do need to start thinking again about an economics of the supply side. I mean, if we come back to that Keynesian distinction between investment, business investment, and consumption, what we saw during the pandemic was support for consumption, and I think broadly it was the right thing to do. We could argue about whether it was calibrated correctly, whether it could have been targeted better, whether middle class households needed the extra cash which they then spent on garden furniture. They probably didn't. Was there a more effective mechanism for getting the cash to those who needed it? There might have been. But I think the more important point here is that what I'm worried about is that this consumption expansion, followed by the inflation, may be used to discredit the general approach, the sort of general Keynesian approach, which means that the real stuff, the really important stuff, which is the longer term program of raising investment, decarbonization, net zero, build back better, that's the important stuff. And really that's, I think, the heart of what post-Keynesian economics is about. It's about investment strategy, industrial strategy, planning, that kind of long run approach to ensuring the supply side does have the flexibility that we can then manage demand correctly. And I do think there's a real danger now that the sort of the Keynesian experiment has been disproved, and therefore the baby gets thrown away with the bathwater. So I think that's something we really need to defend, is that idea about long run investment and the supply side.
Yeah, absolutely. Progressive supply side economics. There's a couple of things coming through in chat. I do want to return to the international issue as well. But there's a couple of things coming through in chat. So, one is you mentioned net zero there, actually, just as somebody said it, because people were starting to raise environmental issues, because we were talking, obviously, we're talking about productivity, we're talking about investment, we're being very kind of growth oriented, right? We're talking about expanding the economy. So where do you, and perhaps if you can answer, where does post-Keynesian economics kind of stand on that question, and how does it fit into the environmental crisis? And the second thing people have asked quite a lot about are price controls, right? So there's people talking about how energy companies are making a lot of money, oil companies are making a lot of money at the moment. There's been the windfall tax in the UK, or there will be, I should say. That's just recently been announced. So do you approve of those types of price fixing measures in some cases to try and help manage inflation? And do you think that inflation can be partly attributed to rising corporate profits and corporations opportunistically increasing prices? So yeah, two things: the environmental crisis, basically, and price fixing.
Let's do the second one first, because the environmental crisis, is endless discussion. On the pricing controls issue, I very much favor the idea of the windfall tax. I mean, that one's just very straightforward. Households aren't going to change the amount of gas they're using by and large. They're going to continue to, it's the summer here now, but when it gets cold again, people are going to need to keep warm. All you've really seen, take the UK as an example, as the price of heating goes up, is just a lump sum redistribution from households to energy companies, which we don't know exactly where it ended up, but it'll probably go in dividends back to other households. So the actual consumption patterns haven't changed. People are just doing exactly the same thing they did the year before, but because there's a war in Ukraine, you get this mass redistribution from lower income people to upper income people. The idea that you just use a windfall tax to take that away and give it back to the people that, to allow them to continue to heat their houses to exactly the same point that they previously did, seems completely straightforward. So on that sort of relatively narrow kind of idea, I think it's very, very hard to come up with a coherent argument against it. I think you could expand that idea and say that, from a Keynesian view of where better off people tend to spend a bit less but do spend their income versus lower income people who spend more, you could have offset during the pandemic, for example, those people who, are reasonably well off and saved as a result of not being able to go to restaurants and saw their bank balances do reasonably well during the pandemic. You could have tried to do something like that. You could have had a sort of more broad pandemic windfall tax, which tried to sort of produce that kind of redistribution. And that might have, if well designed, and the problem with designing these things, is you don't have time because of the sort of intensity of the situation, you might have managed to curtail some of that. Maybe luxury consumption isn't the right word, but let's say unnecessary consumption, consumer durables, household goods, and so on, which I think has been an important contributor to inflation. And that would have been very compatible with a kind of post-Keynesian view. What about price controls more broadly? Now, of course, the debate was sparked by my good friend Isabella Weber and that Guardian article over Christmas.
Yes.
and
which wasn't real economics, according to
Nobel
William
Prize
Sanderson at Chicago. Yeah, he wrote that in an exam question for context, everybody.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm mixing up. I was thinking of Krugman's response. But yeah, there was also the non-real economics. I think that my view is that the right way to think about this question is not so much, is there some number called inflation which we want to constrain, and price controls may be a way to do it. My thinking on this is there are some people who are being hurt by shortages of essentials, food and fuel, and we need to help those people. And if that means, if the tool to do that is a price cap, for example, as we have in the UK, it's gone up, but it's not going to have gone up as much once you take into account Sunak's kind of offsetting measures, effectively a kind of price cap for households, that's all to the good. If it's some other mechanism which allows people, some kind of quota system or subsidies, all these things kind of end up in roughly the same place, allowing people to maintain their consumption of essentials. That to me seems to be the right way to think about this, rather than we need CPI to be at 2% and we're going to use price controls to do it. If the prices of some things continue up into the atmosphere, but they're not things that we're particularly worried about, if it's, fancy handbags or luxury holidays or whatever, fine, that could almost be a good thing, but I do think we need intervention both in the short run to protect people's basic needs, but of course in the longer run to reorient both our productive structure to be more efficient, more energy efficient and greener. And I think this is an awkward one for Keynesians, consumption structures and quantities. I do think that there is a case that there's just too much consumption of particularly unnecessary, that's the problem is, where do you draw the line on what's necessary and what's unnecessary? But I remember when I used to live in West London and I would sort of cycle around, and like every third house would have a skip in front of it, and there would be a brand new kitchen that had been installed 3 years previously going into the skip because somebody had flipped the house and moved in and was installing a new kitchen, and the waste was just astonishing. And I do think that capitalism does generate a lot of waste, and we're now seeing the very direct and horrific consequences in terms of climate change. But I think that's an awkward one for post-Keynesians, because a lot of post-Keynesian ideas, for example, wage-led growth, which has been very influential, is the idea that you redistribute from those on higher incomes to those on lower incomes. That stimulates consumption from those on lower incomes. That increase in consumption indirectly stimulates investment, and that's how you raise investment, sort of through these indirect consumption-driven mechanisms. And I've been sort of introducing the idea of consumption-led versus investment-led strategies. And I do think we need to start thinking about moving away from consumption-led strategies towards investment-led strategies. And that's going to be, I think, take some real thinking about how you design institutional structures and policies to do that in an equitable and manageable way. On the big question of green growth, net zero, climate change, and so on, it's clearly a big challenge for post-Keynesian economics, which by and large has thought of expanding expenditure and therefore raising growth as a sort of key policy lever. And it's very obvious that there are now very clear limits to the extent we can use that policy. I don't think that means that the sort of overall analytical apparatus we have isn't still useful. You can use that apparatus to think about how to constrain bits of expenditure while understanding that will have negative consequences for employment and incomes, and therefore you need to design policy to try and offset that. But I do think all of this points in the direction of more government intervention, fairly directly in aspects of economic activity. So rather than pulling the levers of demand, if you like, crudely deficit spending and printing money to stimulate demand and therefore get output and investment up, I think it's going to be more direct supply side industrial strategy type measures for the long run supply side, plus careful demand management, and in some cases, demand constraint, distributionally informed demand constraint, while protecting those who need to be protected.
Yeah, I mean, so there's, I might go through what you said in reverse order, because I asked you two questions anyway, so there's quite a lot there. But the idea, I think, of shifting investment into lower carbon emitting areas of the economy, and I don't just mean the obvious like renewable energy and things like that, right? What I mean also is areas like care, right, where a lot of ecological economists talk about this, and a lot of feminist economists talk about this as well, right? Because care is like a person caring for a person. It's not very capital intensive, right? And if you see an economic shift more towards those types of things as a proportion of the economy, which happens naturally over time anyway because of something known as Bormall's cost disease. But you see, if we try and reorient our economies into that, then we will see, less throughput. But it does require kind of short-term investment as well, just like renewables. But I think that more, I don't know what you could call it, a more labor-oriented or a more people-oriented economy is definitely something that I think would be necessary to try and reduce our environmental footprint. On price controls, yeah, I completely agree. I don't think yet we're going to control prices randomly, or through using, I don't know, some kind of algorithm just to make sure inflation rates, reported inflation rates, are within certain bounds. I don't think that's a very good idea. You need to look at the specific sectors where problems are unfolding. I do want to offer a partial defence of the existing stimulus measures, mostly on political grounds, because I think Claudia Sarms talked about this quite a lot, but she said because of, I forget the specifics of, how it passed through Congress and all of that, but like it was kind of either 2,000 to everybody or basically nothing in the end, right? And that's, this is the tricky thing, right? It's easy in a sense for us to, tinker and be like, oh well, it should have been this or that, but when you come down to the political decision, it's like, right, okay, it's going to be maybe too much for some people, like you said, and they buy a new piece of garden furniture or something, but that's also the only way that we get it to people who need it, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. This is always the problem with both targeting versus universal strategies, and the problem of doing things quickly in the middle of an emergency. And we saw lots of this kind of stuff. You just got to do something quickly. And if it's all or nothing, then probably all is better than nothing. Many of the problems come down to the sort of political economy of just how dysfunctional the decision making is. The US is terrible in this respect, in many respects. The UK is not a lot better, possibly worse in some respects. So yeah, no, my criticisms of the stimulus are very sort of caveated, but I think to say that the US stimulus had nothing to do with what we're now seeing in terms of inflation is probably too strong a statement, and some people are trying to make that claim.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, I've seen analysis of that's convincing. It did contribute. The US slightly outpaces the rest of the economies, so the data support the view that inflation is universal and global, and therefore you can't attribute it entirely to Joe Biden, but also that it's a little bit more in the US. It's I don't know if it's like one percentage point more or something along those lines, maybe a bit more than that even.
Although it may be that the US peaks ahead of the Eurozone and the UK, and then in 2 years' time we look back and say, it peaked higher in the Eurozone. So I think we still just don't know exactly how the dust is going to settle. There is a very uncomfortable political economy here, which gets to the heart of lots of the wider political economy, is the rich people in the US versus the everyday people in the US, is how this is kind of framed. We've got to help the everyday people in the US, and I absolutely agree with that. But there are the people in the rest of the world, and like I said, I'm very concerned about the potential for people in lower income countries to get hurt. And I think these kind of political economy trade-offs between rich and poor within rich countries, as well as those in lower income countries, is where things get really very difficult and very politically ugly, particularly in the current climate of sort of anti-migration, xenophobia, culture war kind of stuff. It's very hard to say, we need to think about designing our domestic policy not only to try and overcome the kind of the far right lunatics in Parliament in the UK at the moment, but also to try and avoid hurting people in other countries as well. And there's just no political space to even have the discussion. But as economists, I think we do have to be thinking about it.
No, okay, so yeah, that's a very seamless segue. JDM Gaming 1 says, so could you clarify what you mean by stimulus? Do you mean the individual stimulus checks or the business loans? Well, as we discussed, the individual checks are probably not best thought of as stimulus. They're probably best thought of as survival, and the business loans as well. What we were actually talking about was Biden's stimulus since the depths of lockdown and all of those fiscal stimulus policies. I think is that right? Do you agree, Joe?
Yeah, although I think it's very hard to disentangle. Take the UK example. There's clearly been a lot of household saving during the pandemic because people's incomes were protected, and I think that was the right thing to do by and large, and they were protected by the government. But people on higher incomes who were spending less on services, they're going to the pubs and restaurants and having a nice time, saved it. And now some people are worried, although there isn't a great deal of evidence of this, that's those savings are going to be spent and run down. But it's clearly not broadly across the population. It's middle and upper income people have saved and those on lower incomes have dissaved. But it may still be that there's disposable income, which will then contribute to, alongside stimulus measures, proper stimulus measures, to demand for certain types of products, which put pressure on supply chains and serve to exacerbate inflation. So I think, broadly speaking, stimulus in the sense of post-pandemic stuff, but it's kind of hard to disentangle as well.
It is. Yeah, it has all had an effect. So returning to the international dimension. So most discourse about economics and about everything is pretty US centric. When it's not about the US, it's about the EU or Europe and the UK. But the thing is, number one, there are other countries, right? But number two, the policies pursued, the types of policies we've just been talking about, the quote unquote stimulus policies during the pandemic, in the US especially, but also in the richer countries more generally, they have a massive effect internationally, right, on other countries. And it's something that's not often a part of the decision, for which there are maybe some understandable reasons and maybe some less understandable reasons. But you were recently involved in a report for UNCTAD, right, called Tapering in a Time of Conflict, which is about this. So could you explain what that report's about, and also, what does the title mean exactly?
Sure. Yeah, so I worked alongside UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva, for a few months earlier this year to assist in producing this report, which they put out at the end of March. Tapering in a time of conflict refers to the first part. Tapering refers to the idea that we're now in a phase in which we've had very loose macroeconomic policy, particularly monetary policy, so very low interest rates, huge amounts of QE. During the pandemic, QE, quantitative easing, this sort of technical monetary operation, which I talked about, increased in the US and the UK by almost as much as the amount it had increased in the entire period since 2008. So central bank balance sheets are now huge, over 100% of GDP in the US and the UK, much bigger in Japan, but that's a different story. And we're now, I think, into a situation of what's called tapering, which sort of on a narrow technical sense refers to the Federal Reserve reducing its holdings of government bonds, so reducing the outstanding quantitative easing, but is also used a bit more broadly just to refer to the general tightening of policy, so the raising of interest rates, rolling off of quantitative easing, fiscal tightening in the sense of reducing the government support packages from the pandemic, perhaps raising taxes in the wake of the pandemic to try and reduce government deficits. So we're using tapering in that sense, tapering in the sense of rich world driven by the US, but other countries will follow suit fairly reliably. Already the United Kingdom is into raising interest rates, rolling off QE. The Eurozone looks like it's following suit. Interesting splits appearing with Asia. East Asia is doing its own thing. We could come back to that, but Japan is not tapering, and China is, if anything, loosening. But we might come back to that interesting emerging split later on. And the in a time of conflict element of the title refers to the Ukraine conflict. The report was initially going to be focused, so purely on the aftermath of the pandemic, the US tapering in response to inflation, and the likely effects of those policy shifts for lower and middle income countries, and all of the usual dynamics which I mentioned earlier, reversals of cross-border flows as monetary conditions tighten, investors close out positions in emerging markets, in holding of Brazilian government bonds, and try and get money back on shore to cover positions, to cover losing positions because financial markets are falling, higher interest costs on leverage, and so on. A rush for the dollar. We saw these dynamics actually in March 2020, and I think it's gone a bit under the radar. March 2020, I think, was a really important moment. Things were quite bad there briefly in terms of the rush for global dollar liquidity, outflows from emerging markets, spiking money market rates in the US and so on. And we saw very concerted action, liquidity in the form of QE, swap lines were opened. We've seen a number of interesting policy responses. Even the IMF has sort of opened the liquidity taps. Again, we might want to come back and discuss that in a bit. So I think March 2020 was a very fragile moment, which didn't quite get the same sort of coverage as some of these other kind of so-called Minsky moments, but was offset by policy action. But I think now we might be seeing the same kind of thing in kind of slow motion, not quite the same sort of crisis dynamics, but the next 3, 6, 9 months are going to see policy space for lower and middle income countries really tightened. They're going to have to raise interest rates ahead of, and what we've seen is many of those countries have raised interest rates ahead of the US to try and keep the difference, to make sure their interest rates are well above US rates to stop the capital outflows. That's going to raise the debt payments on government debt, but also on corporate debt in those countries. So you're going to see fiscal tightening to try and counteract the cost of government deficits. And of course, they have much less capability of running deficits sort of indefinitely than countries which issue their own currencies, countries which have so-called monetary sovereignty like the US and the UK. Countries lower down that currency hierarchy really sort of financing conditions come from somewhere else, and when they tighten, it's like for you or I, if the interest rates on mortgages or credit card loans goes up, you're just poorer, and you're going to have to deal with it. And this is coming at the same time as this global food crisis. Shortages of food, shortages of fuel, and already we're seeing horrific looking statistics on increases in hunger, famine. I mean, the Horn of Africa at the moment is experiencing horrific conditions in terms of famine conditions, and I think it's quite likely. And the report came out in the end of March, and it wasn't clear exactly what was what was going on, but the direction of travel was fairly clear. Inflation tapering, and then these kinds of well-known, and we've seen them before, dynamics of reversals from lower and middle income countries. But then during the writing of the report, the war in Ukraine started. It was towards the end of the report. So then, of course, we had to adapt the analysis to take into account that. So that was reflected in the title, Tapering in a Time of Conflict. So it's kind of depressing reading. We sort of, in more detail, we spell out the likely trajectories, point to some leading indicators in terms of exchange rates, capital flows, bond yields, and so on. And already, it's getting on for 3 months now since that came out, and I think we're a lot further down the road in terms of those kind of dynamics are playing out as we feared they might.
Yeah, so I mean, these countries are much more vulnerable than perhaps the Western countries, you might say, because they are less in control of their own policy, especially monetary policy. They are reliant on especially US dollars. Often they may conduct a lot of their transactions in US dollars. Their debt will be in US dollars, and like you said, you can't print that, so it's more like for them it's more like a credit card company demanding payment, whereas for us it's it's a little bit it's less severe than that. So they have much less space, I think, and they're more vulnerable to the whims of investors and the policies in richer countries, and the sudden flows and volatility that can result from those things, right? And I think one of the central things about post-Keynesian economics, that one of the many things that I always liked about it, was that it kind of it did place these financial flows in the spotlight, right, as kind of primitive and something that actually determines what happens in the real economy, as opposed to the other way around, where a really traditional sort of neoclassical perspective might say, well, there's the real economy, and then all the financial stuff adjusts to reflect that. This is much more the other way around, and this is exactly the type of thing that you're talking about in this report, right?
Yeah, exactly. The idea that the financial system is a kind of actor in its own right. I mean, let's not what's the word? Let's not treat it as a person, finance as the markets are doing this. But the idea that the alternative view, which is that finance and money just represents the sort of the accounting after the fact of real activity. Once you've got jobs and production and international trade and so on, then you've just got a kind of score sheet of who owes who what and how it's been priced. The idea that financial actors, financial flows, financial incentives are actually driving much of the dynamics that we see. For example, when there's cross-border lending, let's say a UK bank makes a loan in the US, the financing comes first. There's a financial action, and then, okay, you might find that consumption changes in the US. Somebody has a loan which they didn't have before, and they increase their expenditure, and that can show up in more imports, and that can then show up in the trade balance. And without getting into the nitty-gritty details, there's certain accounting which shows that the financial flows one way have to match the sort of trade flows the other. And the traditional view of international economics has really been, it's all about trade. It's about competitiveness, productivity, market share, and so on. And the other side of the balance of payments, what's called the capital account, which I think is a bad name. The IMF calls it the financial account, which is a better name. It's called the financial account. The financing just sort of, passively adapts. And increasingly, I think people are really understanding that it's to a substantial extent the other way around. Financial incentives, financial actors, investment decisions, particularly in rich countries, drive financial flows. These affect a whole range of things, from interest rates to exchange rates to expenditure, therefore potentially to inflation. And the financial system has this sort of this life of its own, and that's always been the sort of the heterodox post-Keynesian view of how international things work. I think Tooze was very important, actually. Adam Tooze, his book Crashed, really
Yes.
brought out some of the details of this kind of idea that the financial system is an important independent force which can drive the other side of the equation, the real side, just as much as the other way around. And I think this is an important element of sort of development in post-Keynesian economics. My colleague Nina Kaltenbrunner at Leeds, I think, has really sort of pioneered sort of international post-Keynesian economics, drawing on the ideas of people like Minsky to try and sort of throw light on this stuff, which is, it's really difficult. The accounting's really hard. I mean, one thing that post-Keynesians do like is trying to get the accounting right, trying to understand the different balance sheets and how they fit together. And even for inside a single country in a domestic economy, the national accounting is quite complicated, and you even when you're well practiced on it, it's very easy to make a mistake. If I haven't had my coffee in the morning, I could easily lose a minus sign and be talking English before I realize it. But once you get to the international accounting, it really is difficult. Gross versus net flows and which side of the balance sheet you're on. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but it's important and interesting stuff, and we are sort of making progress, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, you were talking a little bit about swap lines at central banks, so like exchanges of one currency for another, which have been a big thing that the US and other big central banks like the ECB and the Bank of England, a big thing that they have been doing since the 2008 financial crisis, really, and that's something Adam Tooze talks about in depth, and that's really helped them to stabilize their economies in an extremely volatile period. Now, of course, these swap lines aren't open to the poorer countries that we've just been talking about, that are much more affected by these by any type of volatility in global financial markets. You said something about the IMF starting to provide liquidity. Is that like a policy that's been pursued to try and help out these countries? Are there other ones that have been, and are there some ones that haven't been that you'd like to see?
Yeah, so now we're getting into the real nitty-gritty of the sort of international financial architecture. So yeah, the swap lines are these arrangements whereby the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, which effectively prints dollars, offers those dollars on a short-term basis, to swaps them with another country, say the European Central Bank. So the European Central Bank gives the Federal Reserve euros, the Fed gives the European Central Bank dollars, and the European Central Bank can then use those dollars to support, for example, banks in the Eurozone, which have made dollar loans and then are struggling to actually fund those loans, to find people to lend to them so they can service their own debts. And as you say, they're very limited. I think there are around 15 central banks have access to central bank swap lines. Of those, the only countries that you would classify as lower or middle income, I think, are Brazil and Mexico, depending on how you classify Korea. I think Korea probably isn't a lower income country anymore. It's a high income country. And even among those countries that have access to the swap lines, the usage is very, very uneven. So Japan, Bank of Japan, is by far the biggest user of US swap lines, and that's to do with substantial dollar exposures, I think, in the Japanese financial system. European Central Bank uses them fairly extensively, Bank of England, and then as you get down the list, they're much, much smaller usage. There is another facility that the Federal Reserve offers called the FIMA, F-I-M-A, and I've actually forgotten what the acronym stands for. Federal something, probably. MA could be market access. Anyway, FIMA.
Could be.
It's a repo facility, and a repo is effectively a short-term loan. In order to access that, you have to have, first of all, acceptable collateral. So if you want to go to the Fed FEMA facility, you have to have US government bonds. And you say, okay, I'll surrender my US government bonds, $1 billion worth. You give me $1 billion cash that I can use to support my banking system or whatever. And that is open to a much wider range of countries. However, it's limited, first of all, by access to US treasuries. And if you've got US treasuries most of the time, other than in periods of market stress when the bond markets are behaving badly, you can sell them and get dollars anyway. So there's a sort of hierarchical system there, very clear hierarchical system by which, rich countries get pretty much direct print the dollars and hand them to me kind of access. I mean, you have to hand them back at some point, but it's a much more open tap. Lower down the hierarchy, you've got to come, first of all, with government debt, and indirectly that sort of it gives an incentive to countries all around the world to hold US government debt as reserves, and that of course brings down the cost of borrowing for the US government, which is nice in terms of being able to enact stimulus programs and so on and not pay high rates of interest on it. But it imposes like this it sort of reinforces this hierarchy, this monetary
hierarchy. Well it's already, so just to interject, because there's already a hierarchy, right? Because number one, some countries are richer, and being a richer country often comes with power itself. Number two, the US is the reserve. The dollar is the reserve currency, right? But then you've got this whole swap line network, right, which also further reinforces this hierarchy. Before you moved on, I just wanted to ask you: is there any justification for any of this that isn't just it's nice for the US to pursue whichever policies it wants and run a current account deficit and basically have a lot more policy freedom? Or is it just basically the US being the most powerful and kind of having more control over the global economy?
Is there a justification for the global reserve currency being the dollar? Depends what you mean by a justification, I suppose. Is there an ethical justification? I can't really see one. It's political economy, path dependence, and history. We are where we are. We could spend a long time discussing the various factors which gives the US that status. It's to do with, among other things, having a very large and liquid financial system, which is open, having military power, having one of the highest GDPs and GDP per capita of the world. It's a whole bunch of things, and we could argue about which is the more important and the sort of less significant. I would say it's profoundly suboptimal. So rather than saying can we justify it, I would say it's not ideal. It's far from ideal, and it means that there's this very arbitrary power concentrated in US in the Federal Reserve, effectively, to sort of decide who gets access to liquidity and who doesn't. Having said that, I'm glad they did open the swap lines, because things would have been a lot worse. In March 2020, when they reopened many of the swap lines which were previously used after 2008, a lot of bad things I think were averted alongside other liquidity provision mechanisms. But I'm very much in favor of international coordination, and there are a bunch of proposals out there. So Richard Kozol-Wright, who's the director of one of the divisions at UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, has a recent book out, co-written with Kevin Gallagher, an academic, called The Case for a New Bretton Woods. laying out the case for we need some kind of new multilateral, democratic in the real sense of, people are represented by population size rather than geopolitical power and clout. Now you could say, this is all a bit kind of utopian and so on, but you got to make the case for it. Lower income countries need a place at the table, and they need more of a place at the table in these kind of decision making mechanisms, and they need to be part of the insurance. I mean, ultimately, these liquidity systems are a kind of insurance mechanism to share the costs of things like supply crises as a result of climate change, war, and so on. And at the moment, the costs are very unevenly shared. So I think it's not good that the architecture we have. It's perhaps not the absolute worst it could be, but there's huge amounts of room for improvement. You mentioned the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
Yeah.
So they introduced something called, there's a thing called a special drawing right, which is a really sort of boring technical kind of name, but it's effectively a sort of money. It's a kind of an international currency administered by the IMF. You can swap it freely into dollars, which means it's money. If you can turn it into dollars, it's money. The IMF can basically print them. That's the rules of the game. They don't generally print them, but they can. And in doing so, they effectively expand the global money supply, and they sort of provide liquidity. In the last year or so, I forget exactly when it was, they printed 650 billion, I think was the figure, of new special drawing rights, and they allocated them to all countries of the world. Some have accessed them and used them already, some haven't, but they have the right to access them on demand. It's good and bad. The good thing is developing countries, or lower income countries, I should say, received, basically a free tranche of liquidity which they can draw upon as needed, and they're going to need it. Many of those countries are going to need it. The bad is the distribution is wildly skewed. So the distribution is based on paid in capital to the IMF, how much you are technically a kind of shareholder as a country of the IMF, which means the big countries got, the rich countries got by far the bulk of the new issuance. Lower income countries got, sort of crumbs from the table. Now they're not insignificant. They will help. But overall, I think it's a sort of microcosm of the problem. We need these big international liquidity sharing, risk sharing mechanisms. You can kind of see the beginnings of how that kind of architecture would work, but you also see all the flaws of the sort of international imbalances and the power structures in the way that they're currently used, and how it is really, I think, sort of crumbs from the table of the rich countries going down to the poorer countries. The reform of this kind of international financial and political architecture is just a hugely thorny political problem. I mean, in the current climate in the UK, it's hard to imagine many politicians going out and campaigning for a general election on, we're going to reform the global financial architecture. Many people in this country are really concerned day to day about putting food on the table, being able to heat their houses, and they'll listen to the horrific right-wing press we have here, which says, it's a zero-sum game. It's you or people in other countries, and you need to learn to be more xenophobic and more anti-immigrant and so on. Whereas, I think there are mechanisms by which we can do both. We can redistribute both internally within countries and internationally.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of brings us full circle, right? Because we were talking about Keynes and how many different ideas he actually had, and one of them was the Bretton Woods international financial system, which was established in 1945 or maybe 46, and it eventually fell apart in 1973, and that was somewhat more democratic than perhaps what we have now. It was certainly more explicit. There was explicit management of currencies. Now we've got kind of more implicit management through the US, through all the mechanisms you're talking about in the report. But it was still Western dominated, right? It was US dominated, and that was one of the things that Keynes. I'm not sure he would be classed as a crusader for poorer countries. Keynes, he was a bit of a UK elitist, to be honest, but he definitely didn't want it to be based around the USA, and eventually it was. So even though Bretton Woods, that system collapsed, we're probably still living in the aftermath of that, of the sort of hierarchy that was set up then, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So So, one final thing I wanted to ask you about, and I think people seem very interested about these currency hierarchies. I have to say, I mean, I've sent them the report. Do you have any other recommendations for them to try and understand more about dollar dominance and things like that?
Yeah, there's a few things out there. So there's work by people like, as I said, Anina Kaltenbrunner at Leeds, Bruno Bonizzi, Jeff Powell. They've been writing on, it's a bit of a mouthful. They call it financial subordination, but the mechanisms by which these kind of financial hierarchies and monetary hierarchies function and are maintained. I don't think there's any sort of, there's no textbook out there yet on this stuff. It's relatively in development. I've written something with Bruno and Nina called Monetary Sovereignty is a Spectrum. It came out in the Real World Economics Review a year or so ago in a special issue on modern monetary theory. And it's partially a critique of the modern monetary theory approach to these issues. But it also, I think, discusses and highlights many of the important issues there. But I think this literature is ongoing and developing, and some of it's quite academic. There's a guy called Yilmaz, actually, who was previously at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, and his stuff quite nicely describes quite a lot of this kind of dynamics as well about currency hierarchies. It's a bit earlier, so you could also look into that literature.
Yeah,
There's not a
thanks.
great deal of more popular kind of directed. It's a bit in the academic ivory tower, I think.
It
Still, some
is,
of this
yeah.
material.
I'd say Michael Hudson's probably the person who, I mean, he's still kind of academic. He's quite dense, Hudson, but he's also quite readable despite that. He has a very strange and unique writing style. I quite like Michael Hudson, but he's got that book,
And
Super
speaking style.
Imperialism. What's that?
And speaking style.
And speaking style. Yeah, he's very unique guy, sort of
Yeah.
really academic, but really kind of down to earth at the same time, and very clear but also very rough around the edges. Yeah, very unique. But yeah, Super Imperialism is a book on global dollar dominance. One other thing I wanted to say is, like, I mean, we're thinking about, do UK politicians, can they campaign on reform the global international financial system? I mean, one thing about the establishment of Bretton Woods was that it clearly took place straight after World War II, after the international system had failed, but arguably several times in a row. And that was enough to actually get people to call for reform. I mean, I wonder if one of the, I don't know how to phrase this, but one of the things we may be able to do to make some progress in this area, given the current political context, is to draw people's attention more to the international financial system, right? Given things like the war in Ukraine and the pandemic and global inflation, as horrible as those things are, is there a chance that they've made people realize that, these things matter? You can't just look at domestic policy. We're very interconnected, and we need to think about how things fit together, because, now oil prices are going up so much, and that's not directly because of domestic policy, right? It's much more indirect. So I wonder, is there some opportunity for us, armed with our post-Keynesian economics, to try and push for these kinds of reforms that benefit, the median citizen in rich countries as well as the median citizen in poor countries?
Yeah, I mean, we're clearly in a serious crisis. We've been in a sort of crisis, I think, since 2008 in terms of macroeconomics and the sort of broader monetary, financial, fiscal architecture. And we haven't yet seen the sort of new era which emerges out of it. Historically, you do see these kind of, about once every 40 years, these kind of big meltdowns and then fundamental changes of financial architecture coming out. End of World War II and Bretton Woods, and then the inflation of the 1970s and the breakdown of Bretton Woods, followed by the emergence of neoliberal monetarists, whatever you want to call it, sort of the free market system we've been living with for about the last 40 years. It does feel plausible that we're in one of those kind of moments, and something new will come out of the ashes. Whatever it's going to be, it's going to have to be informed by the climate crisis. I think all sides can see that, green in inverted commas is where we're going. I did some stuff with Yanis Defermos and Daniela Gabor on this, trying to do a bit of crystal ball gazing. We used the idea taken from Minsky of a super cycle as this sort of this period of institutional stability followed by everything falling to pieces, and then sort of a political battle for ideas and for architecture, new architectures, followed by a new phase. And we say it's going to be green in some sense, but there's sort of two ways it can go. There's a kind of Green New Deal, state investment led, hopefully alongside, redesigning the international financial architecture kind of approach. Or there's what Daniela Gabor calls Wall Street consensus, the sort of finance-driven, green-branded, but to an extent, to a substantial extent, greenwashed, private sector, private finance, sort of driven next phase. And on this, I'm sort of optimism of the will, but pessimism of the intellect. We've got to fight for the Green New Deal and the good super cycle or the good new era, but at the moment I think the balance of probabilities is against us and probably points towards the miserable sort of finance driven neoliberalism 2.0. I don't know quite what the right branding is. I quite like Wall Street consensus. Daniela's branding I think is quite good for this, but yeah, we've got to make the case. We've got to try and push wherever we can. It's not lost yet. There is a window of opportunity still, I think.
There's also eco-fascism though. You missed out that one, right? We could go down that
Sure.
route.
I mean, I was giving a very crude two stories. Yeah, there's all kinds of lurking ideologies out there. Eco-fascism and I think various overlaps between far right and far left. You can also see eco-fascism is perhaps one aspect of that, but there are sort of other manifestations out there which are certainly alarming and need to be highlighted and pushed back against.
Yeah, I was just being negative when I said that. Yeah. Thanks so much, Jo. This has been really interesting, as I anticipated. Do you have a short amount of time for a bit of Q&A? I mean, we've interacted with chat a bit, but if anybody has...
It's to chat for 2 hours, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's
quite nice to be able to give an answer without you interrupting me and saying, yeah, but what do you think about... this hot political topic of the day.
Yeah, exactly. This is the great thing about streaming. Everyone always comments.
When I talk to Nick Ferrari, I don't get this long to...
Exactly. So, people saying... I mean, one person asked earlier, just before, because the people will be thinking of questions now. We were talking about currency hierarchies, this is a very difficult question, by the way. To what degree would you say existing income disparities between countries are explained by some of these hierarchies?
That's an excellent question, and it's not one I have a good answer to. It's been something which has preoccupied sort of critical political economists for a long time. Dependency theory is a set of ideas that come out of Marxist ideas, which sort of take the view that capitalism is always looking for new victims, and there's a sort of core periphery dynamic where the core preys on the periphery. A slightly less fire and brimstone version associated with many Latin American economists, the idea of unequal trade and secular decline in the net terms of trade. These are much more technical sounding terms, but the idea is kind of the same, that in some way richer countries have got mechanisms by which they take more than their fair share from poorer countries. And actually many of those economists are closely associated with UNCTAD, with the organization, the branch of the UN that put out that report I was discussing earlier. And I do think that there is something to it. I think it's very, very difficult, coming back to science and economics. I think it's very difficult to point to the smoking gun, to run the regression which says, look, there it is, there it is happening. But when I look at the rates of interest on government bonds in lower income countries, and I look at the way they spiked in response to the inflationary spike, to the taper, and to the war in Ukraine, from already, very alarming levels, maybe from 8% to 12%, or from 12% to 15%. And you think that these are very low income countries where the government is dealing with much more pressing, we have pressing issues all around the world, but the order of magnitude kind of difficulty of the problems being faced, and they're being squeezed, these kind of interest rates to provide an income for the wealthy people in richer countries. I get quite Marxian. I sort of look at this in terms of labor theory of value terms, and it just feels like there's something badly wrong there. Now, sure, you can construct a model which says this is just the price of risk. There's more risk in these countries. There's lower quality of institutions, more corruption, etc. So treat all that stuff as exogenous, and then you just sort of say, okay, well, that's the rate of interest you have to pay. I just don't buy it. I think there's a better architecture which could reduce these kinds of, they do feel like kind of expropriation flows from poorer to richer countries. I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's a sort of instinctive answer rather than a technical answer. But I think it's very hard to do technically.
No, it is. Yeah, what's the amount that you would reduce inequality? In fact, I would argue that's the kind of question that we probably can't answer. Although what I would say is that if we were to have a more democratic monetary financial system internationally, then I think there would be noticeable differences. I would say substantial improvements, right? Is probably the word I'd use, but it's putting a number on it like extremely difficult.
Yeah, it's very clear that the current architecture profoundly inhibits policy space in countries that really need policy space, and you can see, I think, fairly straightforward changes that would provide that policy space, and I think that could have very significant material benefits for very large numbers of people. So I think it's a fairly straightforward case in my view.
Yeah. People are asking about, okay, so people have kind of mentioned the toxic culture of the economics discipline, which is a little bit of a different topic. I don't know if you watched my most recent video. I think it was my most recent video. There's such a gap between them that I can never remember. But how do you generally feel about the economics profession and the culture of it, and right-wing bias within it is something else that people asked about.
Yeah, I haven't seen the video. I'll go back and watch it if it's on this topic. Yeah, that's a huge topic to delve into. I think it's well documented now, on a fairly scientific basis, that academic hierarchies and structures and so on do tend to reproduce and reinforce many of the social inequalities and inequities and prejudices and so on along racial and ethnic and gender lines, not only those, but those kinds of lines where white old men like me tend to do well, not because of their inherent abilities, but because, at least to a substantial extent, because they are old white men. Economics seems, and I think there's fairly good evidence for this, to be an extreme outlier. Well, maybe not extreme, but it seems to be at one end of a spectrum. It's not the only subject which has these pathologies in academia.
Yeah, philosophers can be pretty nasty.
Yeah, but economics does seem to be a particularly pathological case. Economic job market rumors is one example that people often point to. You can just raw sewage of bile.
I have an entire section on that in the video.
Yeah, and then I think there's a really interesting open question about to what extent this is connected to the theoretical content. To what extent is this to do with the content of neoclassical mainstream textbook economics or whatever? I think that's a really difficult one. I think there probably is a connection, but I think it's probably not quite as direct as some might say. I think people who are of that mindset, of the kind of the unpleasant, prejudiced mindset, may be drawn to that way of thinking, because in a crude sense, you can see justification, for this kind of, far right, almost kind of fascist kind of mindset. But I think one's got to be very, very careful. And heterodox economics, where I'm coming to say that this is a problem of the mainstream, and I think that's absolutely not the case. I think many of these problems are manifest in heterodox circles, in post-Keynesian circles. In fact, this week we have the Post-Keynesian Economics Society, of which I'm secretary, annual workshop that's going to be on Thursday, and one of the things that society has been coming to terms with over the last year is the fact that we have not done well enough on that front. We have had an all-white committee, and we've not been careful enough with making sure that our events are diverse, that we're open and welcoming, as we should be. So I'm going to have to say some words on that subject. So I think, it's a huge can of worms, and we've just all got to try hard to look for it, to do our best, and to make amends, and to admit when we've made mistakes, as have I, and have organisations that I've been involved in.
Yeah, sometimes it's frustrating because you feel like actually mainstream economists have become better at the including marginalised communities. I mean, you just recently, the Journal of Economic Literature, like yesterday or something, released a whole symposium on race and economics. I don't know if you saw it, with a lot of papers by black economists about black economic issues, right? And I think heterodox economists have maybe been want to assume that just because we're kind of marginalized in an intellectual sense, we're kind of taking care of that problem just by virtue of being heterodox economists, when actually, if you look at the whole thing, it's just got many of the same problems, as you said, with toxic cultures and with white men being in charge. One other thing you've been asked about, and again, this is a bit of a curveball. What do you think of worker democracy, and do you have an opinion on Richard Wolff, the economist in particular?
I might just swerve both of those swerve balls. I'm not sure exactly what is meant by worker democracy. I think I probably need a bit more specifics on sort of what is it we mean. What kind of institutional structures? I mean, in general, I'm in favour of it by the sounds of it, but I think the specifics matter. I'm in favour of more bargaining power for workers. In general, I'm in favour of collective bargaining mechanisms, although I think we're in a very different place now to where we were in the 70s. We're not going to go back to kind of union collective bargaining, but we need new mechanisms that match our current institutional and kind of labour market structures, to provide worker voice. But that may not be at all what's meant by that question.
That's more that's more worker bargaining power. I think we're talking about like workers directly electing managers and perhaps even running workplaces themselves and making key decisions.
Right. I think there's a lot to be said for these kind of ideas implemented carefully and done well. I mean, the danger is once the workers become elected to the position of manager, they then sort of, what is it that stops them becoming a manager? We all know the union rep who worked their way up through the management and is now a manager. So I think we definitely want new institutional structures which redistribute power from finance, from shareholders, from international capital markets, from ineffective middle managers. But I don't think it's dead straightforward. I think it's more than just a case of getting rid of all the top layer and having a vote or something. So that's probably another 2-hour whole discussion. I'm not the expert on this stuff. There's some really interesting stuff in this kind of space being done in UK think tanks and US think tanks, actually. Commonwealth, Autonomy, some of the US organizations are really thinking hard about how to redesign institutional structures, including the workplace, but also municipal kind of structures and so on. And sort of thinking hard about how to try and get this right. But it's fascinating, but I'm a bit of a tourist on that kind of stuff. Is the
Yeah.
honest answer.
There's another thing I've made a video on, but yeah, it's like I kind of agree with you. I mean, I came down quite pragmatic in that video, I think, because organizational change is difficult, actually, and I wouldn't want to pursue a drastic kind of now all companies are worker democracies type decree, because I think that would probably be a lot of people would struggle to engage in that, even the workers, and then it would potentially backfire and everybody would be like, worker democracy doesn't work, which is exactly the opposite of what I want, because I do think that it should be the predominant form of organization in the economy, but I think we probably have to get there gradually for both economic and political reasons. One more question.
Sure.
Bit of a Marxist question, I guess, but not really. How does post-Keynesian economics solve the contradiction of big corporations gaining massive economic and political power and using that power to manipulate politics in their favor and bypass regulations?
So I think that's a political economy question rather than a question about the technicalities of economics. Now, of course, they overlap, and there are big overlaps between post-Keynesian economics and political economy. And, for example, Engelbert Stockhammer has recently been thinking about how to synthesize comparative political economy with post-Keynesian growth models and so on. But I'm not sure that post-Keynesian economics really has an answer to that question. I mean, it says that you want to keep corporate power in check. You want to prevent them being able to raise markups, to exert power over workers, in a sort of detrimental way, which results in the fact that workers are getting so little income and the profit share is so high that you then redistribute lots of that to shareholders who only spend it on luxury goods or just save it, and you get kind of dysfunctions in terms of output, employment, and so on. I don't think post-Keynesian economics really says these are the political levers and mechanisms by which you get the power in check. I think that's a sort of, it's this kind of sister question. So I don't think there is an answer to that one. I could speculate a bit on what kind of things you want to do. I mean, I'm very much in favor of tax. I mean, I think that just raising taxes on the wealthy, raising taxes on corporations, and finding good ways to regulate and just outright make the kinds of things you don't want them to do illegal. If there's carbon intensive activity which has no obvious social purpose, I mean, steel and cement production is hard because it's carbon intensive, but we need steel and cement. But there are things like Bitcoin mining, for example, can start a big fight as we close the discussion, or super luxury hotels that burn huge amounts of carbon to just drive people around in big boats having a nice time. I mean, just regulate them out of existence and tax the people who are spending the money on that stuff. It's a sort of a very crude starting point, I think. But obviously the devil's in the detail, like with worker democracy and so on.
Yeah, taxes, more taxes. We're Medlockians in that regard. I'm not sure if you know what a Medlockian is, do you?
Yeah, Medlock. I know.
You know Medlock. Okay, you know Medlock.
The guy
Great.
on Twitter with a nice picture.
Yeah, the picture of Polanyi. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and obviously especially to our guest, Jo, for talking about post-Keynesian economics for over 2 hours. So, yeah, it was really a pleasure speaking to you, Jo.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thanks so much to your invisible audience. It's been fascinating answering questions to... I've no idea who I'm answering to, but it's been a pleasure interacting with all of you, and to you for inviting me.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you, everybody. So I'm going to